Hi, my name is Katie, and this is my Mammalogy midterm. To start this presentation, I would like to talk about the adaptation to reproduce on land. So down at the beginning here, we can see that amniotes gave rise to this split, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But this is an early ancestor of what we know as the synapsids. So the synapsids were, once they came on land, they were able to start adapting to actually laying eggs on dry land. Now, this was an incredible evolutionary adaptation for early mammals because it allowed them more availability to lay eggs and allowed for higher survival rates. So they did this through the amniotic egg. So this is a semi-permeable shell with an embryonic membrane. This happened about 300 years, a million years ago. And then we see this foundational split between synapsids and sauropoda. So sauropoda is going to give rise to this lineage of birds, dinosaurs, and reptiles. But then your synapsids are actually giving rise to what we will see as the lineage of mammals. So during that Paleozoic era in the Mesopotamian period, this is when that foundational split began or occurred. So synapsids really dominated terrestrial fauna. So they, during that early Jurassic period, during this time, there was also one of the largest extinctions that ever occurred. So unfortunately, they did fall vulnerable to this, but they did give rise to another group, which are the Theraspids. They were much more adapt and a little bit more able to survive in these environments and during this extinction. However, over time, it wasn't long before they too declined. But it wasn't before they gave rise to cynodonts, and the cynodonts will give rise to mammals, as you can see in this lineage, to mammalia in the late Jurassic period. Another important transformation would be the jaw articulation. Now I'm going to show you the mammalian jaw as well as the reptilian jaw. So let's start with the reptilian. So they have a jaw joint that's seen between the lower bone of the skull and the bone of the lower jaw. But in mammals, the squamosal and dentary bones actually form this joint. So in the late Jurassic period, cynodonts actually showed dentary squamosal jaw joint for the first time, otherwise known as the mammalian jaw joint. So at one point in time, they were actually using this to determine mammalia. However, it's really not quite that simple because there are several intermediates that show second jaw joints in addition to that quadrate articular joint. And that was probably used for bracing and chewing, bracing and chewing, but also and ultimately for that sound transmission. So over time, and this is unlike the reptilian, over time that mammalian jaw really started to migrate towards the inner ear, and that forms that inner ear that we know today, incus, malleus, stapes, and so forth. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. The secondary palate, as well as the masseter muscle, are other important transformations that I'd like to mention. The secondary palate, of course, we know that it is located where the original roof of the mouth was laid. So it's a bony plate that lies there, and it actually forms a shunt to the back of the mouth so that the airflow is not hindering the young when they are suckling. So that would be one of the main reasons that this adaptation is so important. It just allows that breathing and that eating all at the same time. The masseter muscle, which is also important to note, is that it really changed the way that these cynodonts and theraspids throughout their line. It really changed this for mammals and enabled them to have chewing on both sides of the mouth, more precise jaw movements, and then the reduced stress to that jaw. So this allowed the closing of the jaw and then eventually allowed for more specific movements like we previously mentioned as well. So early mammals' cheek teeth were robust and theraspids were somewhat reversed until that masseter muscle. So just definitely another important jaw articulation to note. Now we're going to get into more specifics with monotremes, marsupials, and placentals. Let's start with monotremes. So these are an early ancestor of mammals before the divergence of marsupials or placentals. It's somewhat debated, but it is seen that they're this bridging gap between our mammals that we see today. And so this happened about 100 or so million years ago. So during the Cretaceous, they were more widespread. So we'll see that a little bit later on, about 120 million years ago, they were a little more widespread. But really, they're independent of themselves. So they're very diverged and very different. So you can see this kind of in the photo how they're very different from marsupials and eutherians. We'll talk about that in just a second. So talking about those differences, the first one I want to mention is the cloaca. So monotreme meaning one opening. So that allows for defecation urination from the same tract. However, this is different in marsupials and placentals. Monotremes also do not have adult teeth. They do have an egg tooth for hatching, but they do not develop adult teeth. Their posture is very reptilian-like in their movements. This is far from true for marsupials, and placentals are very varying, but very different limb type posture. As far as their pouch, so they have a temporary pouch we see in some of the echidnas, but then in the marsupials, we do see that more permanent type pouch, and that's 50%. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then hibernation and torpor, we see that across the board. With monotremes, it is a little bit different. There are some of the long-beaked echidnas that may or may not involve in torpor, but for the most part, they're the same. And for venom, so of course in our duck-billed platypus, they do have that venom spur in their back flipper. And so this is present in some placentals like the shrew, but it's not present in a marsupial. And bioluminescence, which I think is very cool, is somewhat rare in both marsupials and placentals, but is present and we see in that duck-billed platypus. In terms of reproduction, they're oviparous, which just means that they lay eggs and do not have a live birth, which is different from our other subclasses. They do lack nipples, so they actually have hair tufts on them that the young will suckle from. And this is different as we see with our other subclasses, they have those nipples. Across the board, we do see fallopian tubes, mammary glands, and a uterus, so that is across the board. So they all suckle, all mammals are involved in suckling. However, the way that they go about that is a little bit different. And this artificial young, so placentals have this precocial young, we'll talk about that later, but monotremes and marsupials, they have a more undeveloped young when they give birth. Okay. So biogeographical regions, during the Cretaceous period, like I said, they were more widespread. So as we see time go on, they start to digress. So during the Paleocene, they were restricted to what we know as modern day Patagonia. During the Oligocene to Miocene, in all of Australia, they were in all of Australia. And then currently they are restricted to this green section here to the coast of Australia, Tasmania, and New Zealand. Okay, so the Western long-beaked echidna and the Eastern long-beaked echidna is what I chose for my specific species. So the Western long-beaked echidna occurs in New Guinea as well as the Eastern, but the Western really likes this meadow tundra region, whereas the long-beaked is a little more widespread. So both are insectivores. You can see those long beaks that are greatly adapted for that, and they both have these sticky-like tongues that enable them to reach their prey. So humans are a main factor for their concern in decline and deforestation as well. And these probably actually do not use torpor. That was what I was mentioning a little bit earlier. Okay, marsupials. So evolutionary divergence was about 100 million years ago, mid-Cretaceous. Metatherians and eutherians split at this path. And we do see that eutherians had a more evolutionary advantage. So marsupials were very independent for a long time and isolated. So they have a very long and independent history, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Okay, so let's look at some differences here. Marsupials have more of a sagittal plane that's fairly different from our monotremes, like we talked about earlier. So marsupials have pouches, or a marsupium, hence their name. So about 50% of the species have these. Placentals, this is absent, and monotremes, only the echidnas, but they do have a similarity there. The way they walk, marsupials have this very specialized locomotion and specialized feet. If you see them, they look very different from the feet of placentals or monotremes. And so they're very specialized in that way. And so they actually have 2 vagina and 2 cervix. And this is different in both of our other subclasses, of course, with the monotremes. They typically have a long lactation, which is similar to the monotreme. They have artificial young, like we were talking about a little bit earlier, so they do have that undeveloped young. But of course, we do see that fallopian tube, that mammary gland, and the uterus across the board. And then, of course, the board, we see the fallopian tubes, the mammary glands, and the uterus. They also are involved in suckling. Like I said, all mammals do this. However, they do have nipples, unlike our monotremes. And actually, they have quite a few. They have about nipples ranged about 2 to 27. So quite a few, a little bit different than the monotremes or placentals. Okay, so they're biogeographical regions. So, of course, they have two strongholds. And these two strongholds were Australasia and the Neotropic region. So you can see those listed here. Really, they had this very independent history, like we have said before. And so just because of this, they were isolated from eutherians and had a great success in a high radiation. And so without them, they were able to do that. And much more, the eutherians were much more adapted and well suited, but these marsupials did have this isolation, which gave them that radiation. So more currently, there are a North American Virginia opossum, so you can see that in that green area there. And so there was a land bridge that allowed for this northern migration for the Virginia opossum, and this is one of the only successful ones and the only one that we have here in North America. And their biogeographical regions are South America. So you can see about 3 orders there. They're listed here. And then Australia, they have about 4 orders listed there. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. So the species that I chose were this little guy. So he is one of the smallest marsupials, and he's named for his feather-like tail. So this is a feather-tailed glider, or the Acrobates pygmaeus. So they're little of conservation concern, and they're from, there was actually fossils seen from the late Paleocene, and they are capable of torpor. They can actually drop their body temperature from 2 degrees to 2 degrees centigrade. And then we can move on to the rock wallaby from the family Macropodidae. So they're very small as well, about 1 kilogram or so. They're sagittorial, so they jump and use that tail as another kind of appendage. And they're more goat-like in the way that they eat woody, hardy vegetation. And they live in these, you can see these rock boulder-like areas, as well as ledges, caves, and isolated rock stacks, and so forth. So they are of a high conservation concern. They are doing things to help with this due to invasive species and deforestation issues. Okay, the placentals, so their evolutionary divergence was about 125 million years ago. So during this Cenozoic era, they have been the most successful. And then during the Paleocene and Neocene, they dominated all the continents. Of course, South America and Australia, a little bit different due to that isolation with the marsupials. But during that great biotic interchange, this photo you can see here, kind of trying to show that 3 million years ago, this fauna all started to begin to change. And then, of course, during the Holocene, there was introduction by placentals as well, or introduction by humans of placentals as well. So this really created that change in fauna. But of course, we see that the eutherians were a little bit more successful in terms of their evolutionary adaptations, because we can look here at placentals and see that there are 5,100 species, whereas marsupials about 325, and monotremes as little as 5. So you can definitely see that that diversity there. So just looking at some of the differences, we can look at the adult teeth. So their teeth are much different than what we would see in the marsupials or the So of course we see various types of malformed teeth that are really defined by their different cusp structure and shape. I'm going to show you an example of that in one of my examples in just a moment. They possess this corpus callosum, so this hemispheric structure that is absent in the marsupials and the monotremes. As far as where they are located, they're unrestricted. So as we saw with marsupials, they were very isolated to various areas, and as, of course, with the monotremes as well. And we'll look at more of this in a moment as well. They do undergo hibernation and torpor, which, as we saw across the board earlier, is true for the other subclasses as well. They do have a separate opening, unlike the cloaca, so they have several openings for defecation and urination, unlike the cloaca. In terms of reproduction, they have this placenta. So the placenta is actually for the nourishment of the young. It's birthed at the time of the young's birth, and then sometimes ingested for nutritional purposes moving forward with lactation. They have a precocial offspring, so most of the placental offspring are actually fully developed. They are full brain size and able to go and walk and run within a day or two. But we, again, just to reiterate, we see those mammary glands across the board, as well as suckling and nipples within the marsupials and placentals. Of course, with our monotremes, they have hair tufts instead. The biogeographical region, like I said, they are all across the globe, pretty much all continents. There are areas where there are no terrestrial placentals, but because of marine mammals, that they would be located in those areas. We'll see that. So one of my examples is a favorite of mine. This is the capybara, the Hydrochoerus hydrochoerialis. So the class is Rodenta, and the family is Cavidae. So they are a giant rodent, quite literally. So they're endemic to South America. They're highly social, or they're from South America. They're highly social. There's about 100 per group, and they give birth to about 4 young. You can see 2 here. They're not threatened currently, but they are hunted, and they are considered semi-aquatic. They're herbivores and pretty selective eaters. They really try to get the leaves they are looking for, and will avoid others in order to do so. Another placental that is my favorite that I currently work with here in the state of Florida is the Florida manatee. This is a subspecies of the Laterosus, but it's from the family Tritecidae. So if you see this blue line that goes through here, this is where all the manatees are located throughout the Atlantic and Gulf. However, they do move inland to some of these springs. They'll actually die if they are in less than 72 degrees water temperature. So super important for them to be able to be in those areas in the cold months. They're fully aquatic. They're actually related to the elephants. If you look at their hind or their front flippers here, you can see a little bit of that similarity. And they actually have these tactical hairs, or vibrissae. So they have these tactical hairs that help them sense their environment. They are a conservation concern. They have a very long 14-month gestation period. Their sexual maturity is about 5 years old, and they don't breed until they're about 7. So very high on the conservation concern list. So, and this is their teeth. This is the malleoliform teeth I was mentioning a moment ago. So those teeth and those cusps are really designed to tear up this seagrass, and sometimes I'll even see them grazing on grass around the edges. Okay, so moving on to my hearing portion, the sensory organ that I chose this because it's highly developed in mammals. So some mammals actually use this, and about 20% of species will actually use this in order to substitute that for their sight. So in mammals, we do see this pinna. So in the bat, in this vampire bat, it's very obvious of the pinna here. But if you look in something like the bottlenose dolphin, it's not very apparent. So with this vampire bat and his pinna, what's happening is that the sound waves are actually traveling into this pinna shape, so like what we have on our ears. It travels into the inner ear, and it meets this structure of the ear called the cochlea. The cochlea is almost a snail-shaped like structure that contains small hairs and different fluids. When that sound and that vibration hit those hairs in the ear, they're then transmitted into the brain, and then those signals are actually then converted into a nerve signal that is sent to the brain. And so that is the way that sound is transmitted for these mammals. So this is specialized, like we see in this bottlenose dolphin. It's going to be very specialized in a species like this because he depends on this for his hearing, even his orientation, and of course finding his food, as we have seen before. So again, the structure of the incus, the stapes, and the malleus, these are really just these jaw joints, the bones starting to migrate in towards the inner ear, and we mentioned that briefly earlier. So again, I just want to come back to showing you how in a vampire bat, you see this really intense pinna, whereas in the bottlenose dolphin, it's actually lacking or non-evident. So if you look at reptiles, they are very different in the fact that they do not have a pinna. They lack that pinna. And so if we look at their structure here, they have this camella. And so the camella is actually just this structure here that is protected and surrounded by this bulia. So this is a less complex piece than what we would see like before if we go back and see that all of these distinctive parts. So if you look in the skull of the extinct theraspid, you can actually see that they are in red. Birds are actually very similar as well. So they have this camella here, and this is the mammalian ear. So you can see all the stapes, the malleus and the incus there. But then within the avian ear, you only see that camella there. And they do not have a pinna either. So they have this ear hole that is this air is pointing to there. So that would be the difference in those. So let's talk about reproduction and timing. I find this really fascinating. So let's talk about delayed fertilization. So this really, all of these are just a way of pausing reproduction. So males will be able to store sperm within the females long after spermatogenesis or copulation has occurred. So they can actually cease this and then store it throughout the winter. And then they can, when this dormancy period ends, then they can begin the process of fertilization and gestation period. So the long-eared bats, these guys here, they can actually do this, and they can actually do this and adapt for that periodic winter dormancy. So those are the Paleocotus and the long-eared bats. With the delayed implantation, similar to, of course, pausing reproduction, but what happens is this blastocyst will actually float freely. So, ovulation, fertilization, that initial cleavage happens, but then that blastocyst occurs and everything else is suspended. So we see this with the western spotted skunk, so they're from North America, but the males become fertile in the summer, and then fertilization and copulation occurs in September. So the zygote will undergo a typical cleavage, but then it will stop at that blastocyst stage, and it'll float freely for about 180 to 200 days. And then the young are then born in May. So this is also seen in animals like the red kangaroo as well. And then delayed development. So they mate in the summer, or will mate in the summer, and then in the fall, they will not allow for the development until the next spring when food is going to be readily available. So in terms of this Jamaican fruit bat, they're going to delay this as long as they can until that fruit is ready. So they might mate in July or August. That blastocyst will then implant, and then it will become dormant, and then development will be delayed until about mid-November. So this does allow for the young to be born in the spring when the fruit is readily available. So this is a wonderful adaptation. All three of these reproduction timing methods are incredible adaptation for when food supplies are low, or when breeding is really just not, it's really not a good idea at that time. Okay, so in terms of hibernation, we're going to look at true or a deep hibernation. This is the marmot. I love the marmot. He is the largest member of the squirrel family, and he does live in these alpine tundra regions. This is why they have a need to hibernate. They have harsh winters and low food supply. So they enter this in about early September, and then they remain till about April or May. And so this strategy is considered a deep hibernation because of the metabolic rate that is dropped, the heart rate that is dropped, the breathing that slows, which pretty much stops. And they do not wake up until about spring. So typically they have a heart rate of 120 to 200 BPMs, but it actually drops to about 30 BPMs. And they only take about 1 or 2 breaths during this whole period. So again, that was the Marmota flavorientris, or the marmot. Okay, and then of course with the shallow or torpor hibernation method, this is a raccoon. I chose these because I had an experience with one of these guys during this hibernation period. So raccoons are not true hibernators. They can curl up for several days or weeks if need be. They live in various types of environments. So here in Florida, we have them, and they do this if the weathers get too harsh. If the weather is not harsh, they actually will not go into this. So they're not like obligate hibernators where they must do this. They actually have the ability to choose if the weather is too harsh or there is a there's a low food supply, they can go into this and stay for a few weeks. However, they do wake up in between those periods to restore their body temperature, to gain food, to drink, and so forth. And so that is why they are considered shallow hibernators. Here in Florida, the Procyon loader would probably go into hibernation or a torpor in about January to February, because that's when our coldest months are. However, it could be seen in places like North Carolina in December to January. So it really depends. There's no really set time. Like I said again, they don't really necessarily need to do this. They are not obligate hibernators. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch my midterm presentation. Have a wonderful day.